today we have Mr. Dov Zakheim with us. He is the former foreign policy advisor for George W. Bush administration and Ronald Reagan administration. And he's with us today. Again, welcome.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to start with the NATO summit in Vilnius that happened recently. As you know, there were major expectations for this meeting. The Sweden's application for NATO and Ukrainians' expectation of an invitation to NATO. And there were major obstacles for Sweden's application, especially with Turkey's expectations on a better defense against harboring terrorist groups such as PKK. So, do you think there were major progress happened with these application, or you think that NATO didn't get what they wanted?
Well, it depends which group you're talking about. If you want to talk about Sweden, they were mildly disappointed. I think they were very happy that President Erdogan indicated he would support Swedish entry, although subsequently he did say he was still concerned about both PKK terrorists and the burning of the Quran. And that's a dilemma for the Swedes. The latter is because apparently now there was a second burning. A Christian burned it, or at least threatened to burn it. They also, in retaliation, there seems to be threats to burn the Jewish Torah and the Christian Bible. And the Swedish government feels that its hands are tied because the law allows free expression, and the Swedes have defined free expression to include this. So that's a huge dilemma, and I hope they can resolve it. They've gone most of the way, the Swedes have, regarding the PKK, which is why I think Mr. Erdogan was prepared, at least in principle, to accept Swedish entry. The issue still has to go before the Turkish parliament. And the parliament, of course, is controlled, or at least responsive to Mr. Erdogan. So he changes his mind if he feels that Sweden has not delivered on what it said it would deliver. The parliament simply won't vote them in. So there was some progress. Clearly, Mr. Erdogan has opened the possibility of supporting entry, but not, of course, welcoming Sweden in, as some had hoped would happen. On the question of Ukraine and NATO, I think Mr. Zelensky was hoping for too much. I don't blame him. I've written about this. After all said and done, if you look at what Winston Churchill did between 1939 and December 7th, 1941, he was leading a country at war. He did everything he could to get the United States more and more in support of the UK against the Nazis. And so Zelensky's a war leader. He has to do everything he can to help his country win that war. Getting into NATO, on the other hand, it is no small matter. Now, the NATO has set up a new NATO-Ukraine group that would essentially allow for dialogue at the highest levels. It's waived a number of the requirements for entry to NATO, essentially saying that Ukraine can get on a kind of express train to NATO. But on the other hand, it did not welcome Ukraine in. After all said and done, to commit to defending Ukraine in the middle of a war would essentially commit NATO to that war. Now, again, every parliament has to approve going to war. That's part of Article 5. A lot of people don't realize that, but the North Atlantic Treaty does call for the parliaments to approve any decision to go to war. So it's not clear that every parliament would anyway. But in any event, it made a lot of sense for NATO to say, not now, let's see how the war ends, and then we'll move ahead. Mr. Zelensky was bitter about this. He responded in a very negative way, to the point that I understand many inside NATO said, well, you know, if he's going to be so churlish and so negative, maybe we shouldn't do anything for him. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed on both sides. Zelensky effectively apologized for a hot-headed response, and NATO went ahead with the various steps that I've already outlined.
Well, I'd like to ask you about the Turkish-American relations of the last few years, maybe a decade. With the Trump administration, there were a lot of drama, but still a certain level of personal intimacy between President Trump and President Erdogan. But lately, after especially the Biden administration showed up, the relationship have gone sour in a really bad way. We had S-400 drama that turned into F-35 drama and eventually became the F-16 drama. And recently, we see the Turkish Republic has turned into a certain balancing policy between the East and the West. Especially after the Ukrainian war started, we are seeing Turkey became the mediator between the two sides. Do you believe that this is a sustainable policy? And do you think that it's beneficial for Turkey and beneficial for everyone involved?
Well, for a start, there seems to have been a movement on the part of Washington to essentially resolve some issues with Turkey, a sort of outreach, if you will. The administration has made it clear, for example, that it does support sending F-16Bs to Turkey. The problem isn't the administration. The problem is Senator Menendez, and I can get back to that. On the Turkish side as well, I suspect Mr. Erdogan is not happy with Russia just suddenly deciding that it wants to revoke the grain deal, which Mr. Erdogan, working together with the United Nations, worked very hard to bring off. It is not something that I could imagine him to be pleased with. And more generally, it seems that Turkey has been moving closer to the rest of NATO and to Ukraine. It's not the same kind of outlier it might have been a year or so ago. And so while I don't think there will be much warmth between Mr. Biden and Mr. Erdogan, I think there will now be cordiality where there wasn't necessarily before. I think the United States recognizes the importance of Turkey to NATO and as an anchor in the West. Mr. Erdogan recognizes that there are limits to what he can really do with Mr. Putin. And even if he does something with Mr. Putin can change that overnight. And so I'm a little more optimistic about the relationship. Now, when you get to the F-16Bs, the problem has always been, frankly, Senator Menendez, who has opposed the sale. You have to look at the kind of political support he has in the United States. It's from communities that are not particularly friendly to Turkey. On the other hand, I suspect there's more and more pressure on Senator Menendez from the White House, from the administration, that there wasn't before the Mr. Biden essentially went public that he supports this. And I don't think Senator Menendez at the end of the day wants to embarrass the president. So I'm reasonably optimistic that the F-16B deal will go ahead. Now, if it goes ahead, I think it's a tremendous incentive for Mr. Erdogan to let the Swedes in. Because then, he's seen flexibility on the part of the West. The Swedes have made undertakings. They do keep their word, unlike Mr. Putin. And so I suspect that within a few months, the F-16B deal will be approved and Sweden will be in NATO.
You think that it's going to happen earlier than Sweden's entrance to NATO?
I think that Mr. Erdogan's going to wait and see what happens with the jets.